fog hadn't lifted yet when the first engine turned over. It was the kind of morning that Millhaven, Pennsylvania gets in early October. The sky the gray-white of old dishwater. The trees along Route 9 just beginning their slow surrender to autumn. The air carrying that particular smell of wet asphalt and coming change. The Main Street storefronts were still dark. The traffic light at the corner of Main and Grover cycled through its colors for no one. A crow sat on the power line above Holt's Hardware and watched the world do nothing. Then the second engine turned over. And the third. By the time Gerald Holt unlocked the front door of Millhaven Family Diner and reached for the laminated open sign he'd been flipping every morning for 11 years, there were 47 of them. 47 motorcycles. He heard them before he saw them. A sound that started somewhere beyond the edge of town and built with the slow, inevitable accumulation of a thunderstorm that has already decided where it's going. Gerald stood in his own doorway with the sign in his hand and watched them come around the bend on Route 9, single file first, then 2 by 2, then filling the road entirely, Prom catching what little light the morning offered, the rumbles settling deep into the concrete of the sidewalk, into the soles of his shoes, into his chest. They rode past his window. They filled his parking lot. They spilled into the street. They were orderly. That was what he noticed, what his brain reached for in the absence of anything else to hold on to. They were orderly and disciplined, and they were all looking at him. Gerald Holt had been awake for most of the night. He had spent those hours crafting justifications, rehearsing arguments, writing and rewriting the narrative of what he'd done until it fit comfortably inside the frame of righteous ownership and reasonable risk management. He had convinced himself, in the sleepless logic of a guilty man, that he had made a defensible business decision. Standing in his doorway with the open sign in his hand, watching 47 motorcycles park with military precision outside his diner, he found that all of those justifications had quietly dissolved. 36 hours ago, he had fired a woman for giving one of them a free meal. He was about to learn that kindness, even when punished, even when paid for with someone else's livelihood, has a way of finding its way home. Sarah Mitchell had been on her feet for 9 hours when the Tuesday night dinner rush finally died. It wasn't much of a rush by any real definition. This was Millhaven, not Philadelphia, and the population of the town stood at 4,200 souls on a good census year, which meant that a Tuesday dinner rush at the Millhaven Family Diner consisted of maybe 14 tables filled over the course of 3 hours. But Sarah's feet didn't know the difference between volume and duration, and by 8:30 they were issuing the kind of steady, low-grade complaint that she'd learned, over 6 years of waiting tables, to simply incorporate into the background noise of her body, like tinnitus or an old grief. She'd picked up the double shift because Cindy had called out sick, and Sarah never turned down a double shift. The math was simple and unforgiving. She brought in $11.50 an hour plus tips. The tips on a Tuesday night at a diner in a small Pennsylvania town ran between $20 and $30, and Tommy needed new shoes. Also, the field trip to the State Museum in Harrisburg cost $45, and Sarah had been putting that $45 off for 2 weeks, and the permission slip was due Friday. Also, the back corner of the kitchen ceiling had developed a water stain that her mother Carol washed with the quiet anxiety of someone who understands that water stains don't get smaller on their own. Also, you're doing that math thing again, Linda said, appearing at Sarah's elbow with a coffee carafe and the expression of a woman who has worked alongside someone long enough to read their silences. I'm not doing anything, Sarah said. You get this little crease. Linda touched her own forehead, between her brows. Right here, like you're carrying something heavy on your face. Linda Reeves was 50 years old and had been waiting tables at the Millhaven Family Diner for 22 of them. She had the particular competence of someone who had chosen, deliberately and without apology, to be excellent at a job that the world undervalued. She moved through the diner floor with the efficiency of someone who never wasted a step, and she had taken Sarah under her wing 6 years ago with the practicality of a woman who recognized useful people and kept them close. I'm fine, Sarah said. You're always fine, Linda said. That's not the same thing. Sarah counted her tips so far. $12, which was fine. It was only 8:30. She thought about Tommy. He would be asleep by now. Carol put him down at 8:30 on school nights, a schedule maintained with the consistency of someone who understood that children need structure even when, especially when, everything else is uncertain. He would be lying on his side with one arm hanging off the bed the way he always slept, the way he'd slept since he was an infant, as though he was reaching for something just below the mattress. She had a picture of it on her phone. She looked at it sometimes between tables, when no one was watching, the way some people look at photographs of places they want to visit. Gerald came out of the back at 8:45 to do his nightly walkthrough. Gerald's nightly walkthrough was a ritual that served no operational purpose. Linda and Sarah had the floor entirely under control, but it was Gerald's way of reminding everyone that he existed and owned things. He was a thick-necked man with small eyes and the particular confidence of someone who has inherited something and chosen to interpret the inheritance as personal accomplishment. Table 6 needs bussing, he said to Sarah, gesturing at a table that Sarah had already been planning to bus as soon as she finished taking the order at table 4. On it, she said. He stood there for a moment longer than necessary, as though waiting to confirm that his presence had produced the appropriate level of awareness, and then retreated to his office. Linda watched him go. 22 years, she said quietly, and I still have to stop myself from saying something. You never do, Sarah said. Nope, Linda agreed, and neither do you. That's why we're both still employed. She said it without particular bitterness, the way people say true things that have long since been absorbed into the furniture of daily life. Sarah nodded and went to take the order at table 4. Outside, the sky was beginning to do something with clouds and wind that suggested rain. The rain arrived at 9:47, and the motorcycle arrived at 9:51. Sarah heard it before she saw it. A single engine, steady and unhurried, slowing as it approached the parking lot. She was at the counter refilling the sugar dispensers when the headlight swept across the front window. She watched it park, this simple, tired motion of a vehicle being put away after a long day. And then the engine went quiet, and the rider sat for a moment in the suddenly returned silence. He came in shaking rain from his shoulders. He was maybe 29, 30, dark-haired, dark-eyed, with the kind of face that had seen weather and not complained about it. He was wearing a leather jacket that had a chapter patch on the back, a skull with iron wings, and beneath it the words Iron Souls MC/Pennsylvania. And his boots were the boots of someone who had been wearing them all day. He had the carrying posture of a man who is very tired and managing it, which is a different thing from the posture of a man who is not tired at all. He looked around the diner with the careful, habitual attention of someone trained to read rooms. His eyes went to the booths, the counter, the emergency exit. Then they settled on nothing in particular, and he walked to a stool at the counter. Gerald saw him from the pass-through window to the kitchen. Sarah. His voice was low and flat. We're closing early tonight. Tell him we're closed. Sarah looked at the clock above the register. We close at 11, Gerald. We're closing at 10. It's 9:52. Sarah. She looked at Gerald's face through the pass-through. She looked at the man sitting at the counter with his jacket still damp from the rain, his hands wrapped around nothing yet, waiting. She picked up a menu and a water glass. Hi, she said, setting both in front of him. I'm Sarah. Can I start you with some coffee? He looked up at her. His eyes were very steady, and they were not the eyes she'd expected, which she could not have articulated but knew. They were tired and careful, and, underneath that, kind. Not the entitled kind of kind, which asks for recognition. Just kind. In the way that some people are simply kind in the way that some people are simply tall. Coffee'd be great, he said. His voice was low and rough from road noise. And a burger if you've got time. We've got time, she said. Gerald appeared from the back. He stood behind Sarah, not quite close enough to be blocking her, but close enough to make his presence a statement. Sir, he said, I need to let you know, he's a customer. Gerald, Sarah said without turning around. She was already writing the order. Burger with fries. You want anything on it? The man at the counter looked past her at Gerald. Something moved in his expression, not anger, exactly. More like the recognition of something he'd seen before and had decided, long ago, wasn't worth the energy. Just the basics, he said to Sarah. Whatever's easy. She tore the order sheet off and put it in the window. Gerald stood there for 3 more seconds. She counted, and then went back to the kitchen without speaking. The man at the counter wrapped both hands around the coffee mug she'd placed in front of him and closed his eyes briefly, the way someone does when something simple is, in that moment, exactly what they needed. She refilled it without being asked. He nodded. His name, though Sarah didn't know it yet, was Ricardo Navarro. Most people who knew him called him Rick, and the ones who knew him well enough to have earned something more personal called him Ghost, on account of the way he moved through a room, which was quietly, without announcement, there and then not there, like smoke in a doorway. He had been on the road since 6 that morning. He had driven from Baltimore, where he had spent the past 4 days sitting beside his mother's hospital bed in the kind of vigil that has no adequate language, only duration. His mother's name was Esperanza, and the doctors had used the phrase palliative care, which is a phrase that sounds gentle and is not. Rick had held her hand for 4 days and watched her sleep, and then he had kissed her forehead and gotten back on his bike, because staying any longer would have broken something in him that he needed intact to function. He had not eaten since a gas station sandwich outside of Havre de Grace at 7 in the morning. He ate the burger when it came with the quiet, deliberate gratitude of someone who is very hungry and knows it, without performing hunger or hastening it. He drank 3 cups of coffee. He watched the rain on the window. He did not look at his phone. He did not speak, except once to tell Sarah the food was good, which she could see he meant. He was, she thought, someone who was carrying something enormous and had gotten very good at carrying it so that no one could see the weight. The bill came to $18.40. Rick reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and came out with a worn leather wallet. He opened it and went still. He tried the other pocket, then the back pocket of his jeans. His expression shifted, barely, but Sarah was watching and she caught it. The particular stillness of someone who has realized they've made an error they cannot immediately correct. "My cards are in my saddlebag," he said. "Give me 1 minute." "Of course," Sarah said. He went out through the front door into the rain. She stood at the counter and looked at the tab. $18.40. She had $12 in tips in her apron pocket, accumulated over 9 hours of doubles. Linda came up beside her. "Gerald's watching," Linda said quietly. "I know." "Sarah, he's been riding all day," Sarah said. "In the rain." She paused. "He looks like someone who just got very bad news." Linda was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her own apron pocket and came out with $6 in crumpled ones. "That's my coffee tips," she said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Linda said, and put the bills on the counter. Sarah put her 12 on top of Linda's 6. She ran the tab through the register against the tip pool before Gerald could see what she was doing and marked the table as paid. The door opened. Rick came back in, a card in his hand, water on his shoulders. He looked at Sarah. She looked at the register. "We already ran it through," she said. He stood very still. "What do you mean?" "Your card has a hold on it from the road," she said. Which was not true, but she said it the way she said things she was certain of, which is the only way to say an untruth without telegraphing it. It happens with the card reader sometimes. "We ran it through the tip pool. You're all set." He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the register. He was not stupid, not even slightly, and she knew he knew. She held his gaze and kept her face quiet. "What's your name?" he said. "Sarah." He nodded. Not slowly, not quickly, just once, the way a person nods when they're putting something away somewhere safe. "Thank you, Sarah," he said. "Drive safe," she said. The rain's supposed to ease up around Allentown. He put his jacket collar up and walked to the door. Before he pushed through it, he stopped with his hand on the frame and half-turned, and she had the sense that he was going to say something more, something that the road had stripped him of the language for, and then he didn't. He pushed the door open and walked into the rain, and she watched his headlight come on and sweep the parking lot as he pulled out onto Route 9 and disappeared. She stood there for a moment with her hand on the counter. Behind her, Gerald said, "My office." Now, Chapter 4. Pink slip, he didn't do it in the office. That would have been the decent thing, the professional thing. And Gerald Holt was capable of decency in the sense that he was not incapable of it, but he was the kind of man for whom power required an audience. He brought her out to the floor. There were 4 tables still occupied. A couple in the back corner on what looked like a date they were both uncertain about. An older man, Earl Briggs, in his usual booth by the window, 78 years old, retired schoolteacher, drank decaf and read the newspaper every Tuesday and Thursday night like clockwork. 2 women Sarah didn't recognize, probably driving through, splitting a piece of pie. Gerald stood behind the counter and said, "You used restaurant resources to provide a free meal to a customer who did not pay." "I used my own tips," Sarah said. "And Linda's. On the clock, in my establishment, using my register, it went through the tip pool, Gerald. That's our money. The tip pool is a management function. The tip pool is our wages." He looked at her the way small men look at women who correct them in front of witnesses, which is to say with the particular tight-lipped fury of someone who has decided that being challenged is a form of disrespect. "Do you know what liability I carry?" he said, his voice getting quieter in the way that is always worse than loudness. "When you seat a known gang member in this establishment, do you know what kind of lawsuit I'm looking at if something had happened?" He ordered a burger, Sarah said. He ate it and he left. He is a member of an outlaw motorcycle club. He was a customer who was hungry. Gerald looked around the room. He was looking for the audience he brought her out here to have. The couple in the corner was looking down at their food. The two women by the door were looking at the table. Earl Briggs was looking directly at Gerald with the expression of a man who has lived long enough to have no patience left for theater. "You're fired," Gerald said. The word sat in the diner air like something dropped. Linda made a sound, started to say something. "Linda." Gerald didn't look at her. "You want to weigh in on this?" "Go ahead." Linda looked at Sarah. Sarah could see the struggle on her face. The 22 years of employment against the 4 seconds of what was right. Linda said nothing. Her eyes said, "I'm sorry." Sarah understood. She didn't have the luxury of anyone depending on her if she lost her job. Linda had a daughter in community college and a mortgage and a truck payment. Sarah didn't blame her. She would have to find a way to not blame her. "Your apron," Gerald said. "Your keys. You have 5 minutes to get your personal items from your locker." Sarah untied the apron. She put it on the counter. She put the keys next to it. She did not look at Gerald's face because looking at it would have cost her something she couldn't afford to spend. She was at the door when Earl Briggs said, from his corner booth, in the clear and unhurried voice of a man who has spent decades speaking to rooms full of young people and knows how to make himself heard. "That wasn't right, Gerald." Gerald ignored him. Sarah pushed the door open. The rain came in. The last bus had stopped running at 9. Sarah walked 1.4 miles from the diner to the house on Clement Street where she and Tommy and her mother lived. 3 bedrooms and a leak in the kitchen ceiling and a yard that Tommy had once announced he was going to make into a baseball field, a project that had gotten as far as a cardboard base cut into the approximate shape of home plate before losing momentum to the pressing demands of being 8. Sarah knew every crack in the sidewalk on that route. She knew which streetlight on Orchard Street buzzed, and which dog on Maple would bark, and which would just watch. She walked in the rain. She thought about the permission slip. $45, due Friday. She had $12 in her bank account. No, she'd given that to cover the tab. She had nothing in her bank account, and no job, and rent in 6 days. She thought about the man on the motorcycle. About the way he'd held his coffee mug like it was something worth holding. About the way he'd looked at her before he walked out. Not with pity, not with thanks exactly, but with the kind of recognition that passes between people who understand what it costs to do the small right thing. She thought, "At least I know I did it," which was a cold comfort, and she knew it, and she held it anyway, the way you hold a small stone in your hand on a cold night because it's something solid. Carol had the lights on when Sarah came up the front walk. Her mother had the particular ability of knowing, from the sound of Sarah's key in the lock, what kind of night it had been. She was standing in the kitchen doorway when Sarah came in, and she read Sarah's face the way she'd been reading it for 34 years, and she said nothing. She turned and put the kettle on. Sarah sat at the kitchen table in her wet uniform. "He fired me," she said. Carol set 2 mugs on the table. She sat down across from Sarah. "What happened?" she asked. Not why, not what did you do, just what happened, because Carol Mitchell had raised a daughter who did not make careless decisions, and she knew that whatever had occurred, it had a shape worth understanding. Sarah told her. The whole thing. In order. Carol listened without interrupting. When Sarah finished, Carol wrapped her hands around her mug and was quiet for a moment. "You used your tips," she said. "Yes." "All of them." "Yes." Carol was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "Good." Sarah looked at her. "I said good," Carol repeated. "You did right." She took a sip of tea. "We'll figure the rest of it out. We always do." "I need a job by Monday," Sarah said. "I know. The field trip. I've got $45, Carol said. "Don't worry about the field trip." Sarah's eyes filled, quickly, without warning, the way eyes do when the thing that breaks you is not the disaster itself, but the small kindness that arrives in its wake. She blinked it back. "He was embarrassed," she said. "Gerald. He wanted an audience." "Men like Gerald always want an audience," Carol said. "It's the only way they feel real." Sarah nodded. She stood up and went down the hall to Tommy's room. He was asleep with one arm hanging off the bed, reaching for something below the mattress. She stood in his doorway for a long time, and she thought, whatever happens, whatever it takes, he is going to go on that field trip. She thought it with the ferocity of a very tired woman who has decided that ferocity is, at this particular moment, all she has left. She went to bed. She didn't sleep for a long time. The Iron Souls MC compound sat on 40 acres of former farmland 47 miles northeast of Millhaven, accessible by a private road that was not on any map and did not need to be. The clubhouse was a converted barn, reinforced and expanded over 15 years into something that was part sanctuary, part headquarters, part home. The kind of place that held the specific warmth of many people passing through over time, accumulating in the walls. It was 11:30 when Rick Navarro's headlight crossed the gravel of the parking lot. Jake Callahan was in the clubhouse. He was always in the clubhouse at this hour, not from lack of a home to go to, but because the clubhouse was where the chapter breathed, and Jake was a man who needed to feel his chapter breathing. He was 48 years old, 6'2", built like a man who spent his 20s in the United States Army and his 30s making something that mattered out of the person the Army had returned. He had gray at his temples and a scar along his left jaw from a disagreement in 2003 that he declined to elaborate on. And he had the face of a man who has made a great number of decisions and stood behind all of them. He heard Rick's bike, and he heard the way Rick cut the engine, slower than usual, the careful motion of someone managing something internal, and he stood up and poured 2 glasses. Rick came in still wearing his road jacket, still damp from the rain. Jake put a glass in front of him. He looked at Rick's face. "How is she?" Rick sat down on a stool. "Month," he said. "Maybe." Jake nodded. He let the word sit. He'd met Esperanza Navarro twice. A small, fierce woman who had raised Rick alone in a Baltimore row house on a nurse's aide salary and had looked at Jake, the first time she met him, with the level gaze of a woman who knows exactly what kind of world her son has chosen and has decided that she will love him through it anyway, which is the most formidable kind of love there is. "I'm sorry," Jake said. Rick drank. They sat in silence for a while. Outside, the compound was quiet. A few brothers in the far corner playing cards, the sound of someone's radio drifting across from the garage. Rick turned his glass in his hands. Then he told Jake about the diner. He told it the way he told most things, without embellishment, without self-consciousness, in the same flat, factual tone he used for everything from tactical assessments to descriptions of the weather. The diner, the rain, the owner, the waitress named Sarah. "She saw the patch," Rick said. "She sat me down anyway." Jake said nothing. Owner tried to pull her back. She didn't move. He set his glass down. "When I came back in with my card, the tab was already covered. She'd used her own tips. Said it was a card reader issue." He paused. "It wasn't." Jake was quiet for a long moment. "He fired her," Rick said, "right there on the floor. Took her apron. I found out when I circled back to leave a tip. One of the customers outside told me. Old guy. Said the owner made a whole production of it." The clubhouse was very quiet. Jake turned his glass. "She knew who you were," he said. "She knew what I was," Rick said. "Didn't matter to her." Jake looked at the glass. He looked at the far wall, where framed photographs hung in a rough grid. 15 years of chapter history, faces accumulated, brothers who had come and gone and stayed. He looked at the photo nearest to him. 23 men standing in front of this building when it was still recognizably a barn, grinning. The chapter in year 1. He said, "What do you know about the diner?" Rick said, "Millhaven Family Diner. Owner named Gerald Holt." Jake picked up his phone and called Marcus Webb. Marcus was the chapter's financial officer, 35, meticulous, had an accounting degree from Penn State, and a methodical intelligence that the outside world consistently failed to expect from a man with a skull and iron patch on his jacket, which Marcus considered one of his professional advantages. He picked up on the second ring. "Pull up what you can find on a Gerald Holt," Jake said. "He owns a diner in Millhaven. Property records, business filings, anything public." A pause. Tonight, Jake said. He hung up. He looked at Rick. Rick was looking at the photograph on the wall, the same one Jake had been looking at. 23 men, year 1. "She's a single mom," Rick said. "I heard her talking to the other waitress. She's got a kid." Jake nodded. "I should have," Rick started. "No," Jake said. "What you should have done is exactly what you did, which is come back here and tell me." He stood up. "Get some sleep. We're up at 6. Rick looked at him. "Bring your dress vest," Jake said. "We're going for a ride in the morning." Sarah was at the kitchen table at 6:15 a.m. with her laptop open and a cup of coffee cooling beside her keyboard. She had already applied to the Cosberg family restaurant 20 miles out. They weren't hiring, but she'd sent a resume anyway. She had sent one to the diner on Route 30 in Clayfield, and to the Continental Breakfast Service at the Holiday Inn in Westenberg. She was looking at a part-time administrative assistant listing at a plumbing supply company in the industrial park when she heard Tommy's feet on the stairs. He came in wearing his dinosaur pajamas and his hair in the magnificent disorder of a child who sleeps with complete physical commitment. He looked at her laptop, at the fact that she was sitting in the kitchen on a Wednesday morning when she was supposed to be at work. "Day off?" he asked. "Kind of," she said. He accepted this with the philosophical flexibility of an 8-year-old who has learned to read his mother's tone, and climbed into a chair and began constructing a case for why he deserved a larger than usual portion of breakfast. Sarah made blueberry pancakes, his favorite, the ones with too much butter in the batter that Carol frowned at and Tommy adored, and she watched him eat with the quiet, absolute attention of a woman who was memorizing a moment. He talked about a book he was reading, Island of the Blue Dolphins. He talked about the girl who survived alone, and whether he could survive alone, and what he would do first. Build a shelter, he decided. Smart, Sarah said. And find water. Also smart. And then, he forked up a triangle of pancake. I'd find out where the food was. Because you can build a shelter, but you can't build food. Sarah looked at him across the table. You can't build food. She thought about an $18 tab. About $12 in tips. About a night that had cost her a job and given her something she didn't have a word for yet. You're very practical, she told him. He beamed. 47 miles away, Marcus Webb had laid 3 printed pages on the table. Jake read them standing up, as he read everything. He'd never had much patience for sitting while information was available. Gerald Holt, 55, had inherited the Millhaven family diner from his father upon the father's death in 2018. The father had built it from scratch in 1971. Gerald had run it into a debt of approximately $180,000 in unpaid commercial kitchen equipment loans, had twice been cited by the county health department for violations since remedied, and had, per public filings, listed the property for sale through a Harrisburg real estate broker 18 months ago at a price that had attracted no serious interest. His wife, Donna, had posted publicly on social media about her desire to move to Florida. The post had garnered 14 sympathetic reactions, and one comment from Gerald that said, "Working on it, babe." "What's it worth?" Jake asked. The diner itself, the equipment, the building, and the lot. Marcus clicked through his spreadsheet. Maybe $240 on a generous day, with the debt factored against it. An owner who really wants out would take $210 and feel grateful. Jake looked around the room. 47 brothers, some still pulling on vests, some with coffee, all awake and looking back at him. The early hour was not a complaint. It was never a complaint. That was the thing about the chapter that outsiders consistently failed to understand. This was not an organization built on obligation. It was built on something older and simpler than obligation, something that functioned before language developed a precise word for it. It was built on the understanding that you took care of each other, fully and without arithmetic. "We going for a ride?" Someone asked from the back of the room. His name was Denny, and he had the particular gift of asking the question that clarified a room. Jake put on his vest. "We're going for a ride," he said. The engines started one by one, and then two by two, and then all of them together, and the sound built into something that shook the walls of the old converted barn and rolled outward across 40 acres of Pennsylvania farmland into the cold October morning air. It was the sound of 47 people who had decided. Gerald heard it from inside the diner. He'd arrived at 8, which was earlier than usual. He barely slept, and the house felt oppressive in the particular way of a house that contains a decision you made and cannot unmake. He'd made coffee. He'd gone over the books, which needed going over, and which he'd been avoiding for 3 weeks. He'd thought about calling his lawyer and decided he was being paranoid. He was unlocking the front door to flip the sign at 8:15 when the sound on Route 9 began. At first he told himself it was highway traffic. Route 9 had trucks in the morning. Then he counted 5 motorcycles turning onto Main Street. Then 10. Then 20. Then he stopped counting because the counting was making something happen in his chest that he didn't want to examine. They filled the parking lot with the orderly efficiency of a formation exercise, and then they filled the overflow lot next door that belonged to Baxter Hardware and had been vacant since Baxter went out of business in 2019, and some of them lined the curb on Main Street in a single precise row. They cut their engines more or less simultaneously. The silence that followed was so sudden and complete that Gerald heard the traffic light at the corners cycling through its clicks. Then the front door of the diner opened, and Jake Callahan walked in. Gerald did not know Jake Callahan, but he knew what Jake Callahan was the moment he walked through the door, in the way that some people are simply legible. Their history written in the way they carry themselves, in the economy of their movement, in the particular quality of their attention, which in Jake's case was total and unhurried and absolute. Jake sat down at the counter. He looked at the menu board without reading it. He said, "Coffee, please." Gerald stood behind his own counter and found that his hands were not entirely under his control. He poured coffee because he could not think of what else to do. Jake wrapped both hands around the mug. He looked at Gerald with the expression of a man who has already decided what is going to happen and is simply allowing time to complete the arrangement. "I understand," Jake said, "that you're in the market to sell this property." Gerald's voice came out one register higher than he intended. "Who told you that?" "It's publicly filed," Jake said. "Mr. Holt." He set his mug down. "I'd like to make this as straightforward as possible, for both of our sakes." He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and came out with a folded piece of paper. He put it on the counter and slid it toward Gerald. Gerald opened it. It was a single-typed sheet. "Purchase offer, $210,000. Cash, contingent on immediate transfer of title." Below the financial terms, 2 conditions, numbered. 1. All current diner employees to be retained with 15% wage increase effective date of transfer. 2. The employment termination of Sarah Mitchell, enacted October 14th, to be reversed, with Ms. Mitchell offered the position of general manager at a salary commensurate with the role. Gerald read it twice. He read it a third time. The door opened, and Detective Ray Sykes came in. Sykes was 42, 19 years on the Millhaven PD, a solid and methodical man who prided himself on reading situations accurately. He had received a call from Linda, panicked, whispering, barely coherent, and had driven over expecting something that required his professional authority. He stood in the doorway of the diner and read the room. 47 bikers worth of energy concentrated in one space. Gerald Holt the color of uncooked pastry, a very calm man at the counter who had not yet looked up at him. Jake turned. "Morning, detective." He said it pleasantly, neutrally. "Can we get you some coffee?" Sykes looked at Gerald. "Everything okay here, Gerald?" Gerald looked at the piece of paper in his hand. He looked at Jake. He looked at Sykes. "We're having a business meeting," he said. His voice was steadier than he'd expected. "Small mercy." Sykes stood for a moment, parsing. "Everything legal?" "Perfectly," Jake said. Sykes took a table in the corner. He did not leave. He ordered coffee from Linda, who was standing near the kitchen door, having apparently decided that if the world was going to be strange, the least she could do was remain operational. Gerald's lawyer, Barry Fitch, arrived at 9:10. Gerald had called him from the back, standing in the walk-in cooler where he felt least likely to be overheard, which was where Gerald had conducted most of his sensitive calls since 2019. Barry was a small, efficient man who drove a Volvo and had been handling Gerald's legal work for 11 years and had long since made his peace with Gerald's particular combination of pettiness and ineptitude. Barry reviewed the offer. He reviewed it again. He asked Jake 3 questions, politely, professionally, looking over his reading glasses. Jake answered each one directly and completely. "The offer is legitimate," Barry said to Gerald, in the corner of the diner that had been informally designated as their side. "Cash offer at 210 clears your equipment debt with 30 grand to spare. The conditions regarding staff are legally binding upon transfer, but carry no ongoing liability for you personally." He paused. "Gerald, I'll be honest with you. I've been telling you to price this at 220 for 18 months. This is a real offer." Gerald looked across the diner at Jake Callahan, who was on his second cup of coffee and had not changed his expression in 45 minutes. "And if I say no?" Gerald asked Barry. Barry put his pen down. "Then you say no," he said carefully. "And you try to sell this property in a market that has shown 0 interest for a year and a half, with a debt that's accruing interest at a rate that your current revenue does not cover." He picked his pen back up. "That's your right." Gerald looked at the paper. He looked at the 47 motorcycles outside his window, chrome catching the October morning light, patient and permanent as fact. He thought about Donna and her posts about Fort Lauderdale. He thought about the equipment loan. He thought about the empty Tuesday nights and the health department violations and the weight, the specific grinding weight, of owning a thing you no longer want. He thought, briefly and unwillingly, about Sarah Mitchell's face when he'd taken her apron. He picked up Barry's pen. "Fine," he said. "Draw it up." The papers were finalized by 9:47 a.m. Gerald Holt signed his name and felt, against all his prior convictions, something that might have been relief. He shook Jake's hand. Jake's hand was large and dry, and the handshake was firm and ended exactly when it should have. Gerald retrieved his personal items from the office. He walked out through the back. He did not say goodbye to Linda. He did not leave a note. Outside, in his car, he sat for a moment and then called Donna and said, "Start looking at condos." Sarah's phone rang at 10:17 a.m. She was on the couch with her laptop, now working through the classified listings on 4 different job boards simultaneously, with the focused desperation of someone running parallel searches because one direction of hope is not enough. Tommy had gone to school. Carol was at her Thursday morning church auxiliary meeting, which was on Wednesdays, which Carol had never corrected anyone about in 40 years. The number was Linda's. Sarah picked up. Linda was not speaking in sentences. "You need to, Sarah, listen, just come. I know. Just please trust me, and the diner. Just come, Linda. Linda." Sarah pressed the phone harder against her ear. "Are you okay? Is someone hurt?" "No one's hurt. Oh, just please come. Right now. Please. Just come." The line dissolved into something that might have been crying and might have been laughing, and was probably both. Sarah stood up. She put on her jacket. She thought, for one irrational moment, about changing out of her jeans, and then decided against it. She walked out the door. The 1.4 miles felt different in the daylight, on a Wednesday morning, without rain. The sky had cleared. The trees on Orchard Street were doing something luminous with the October light, red and gold, and the particular yellow that always seemed to Sarah like the color of things that know they're leaving and have made their peace with it. She turned the corner onto Main Street. She stopped. Half the bikers were still there. The others had dispersed, some into the diner, some along the street, several talking to curious shopkeepers who had come out of their businesses to investigate the event that was apparently happening on their town's main commercial strip. A small cluster of townspeople stood at the perimeter of the parking lot with the expression of people watching something outside their established experience. Linda was on the diner steps. She came down them when she saw Sarah and grabbed her arm with both hands. "Just come in," she said. "Just come." The diner was warm and full of the smell of coffee and something baking. She didn't know when the kitchen had gotten started again, but it had, and the booths held a combination of bikers and bewildered regulars, and Earl Briggs was in his corner booth looking as though the world had confirmed a long-held suspicion of his that it was fundamentally interesting. A man stood up from a counter. He was large in the way that certain people are large, which is not only a matter of height or breadth, but of weight in the room, the way the space redistributes itself around them. He was somewhere in his late 40s, with gray at his temples and a scar along his jaw, and the face of a man who has made a great many decisions and owns all of them. He was wearing a leather vest over a gray thermal, and the patch on his chest read President. "You're Sarah Mitchell," he said. Sarah became aware that the entire diner had gone very quiet. "Yes," she said. He extended his hand. She shook it. His hand was large and dry, and the grip was deliberate. "My name is Jake Callahan," he said. "I'm the president of the Iron Souls MC. I think we have something to discuss." He gestured at the stool next to him. She sat. Linda appeared at her elbow with coffee before she'd thought to ask for it. "We bought the diner this morning," Jake said. "It's a cash transaction. The transfer is signed and notarized. As of approximately 9:50 this morning, Gerald Holt no longer owns this property." Sarah looked at him. She looked at the room. She looked at Linda, whose eyes were streaming with the total unconcerned freedom of a woman who has decided tears are appropriate and is not managing them. "We'd like you to run it," Jake said. "General manager. Salary. Marcus will discuss specifics with you, but it's above what you were making before, plus benefits. We're not in the diner business, Ms. Mitchell. We need someone who is, and we've been given to understand that you're very good at it." The room was quiet. Sarah opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at the counter in front of her. "I'm just a waitress," she said. "You were a waitress," Jake said. "That's not what you are." She looked up at him. He looked back at her with the same total, unhurried attention he had turned on everything in this conversation. "Why?" she asked. She needed to understand it. She wasn't being ungrateful. She would not have been capable of performing in gratitude at this particular moment, even if she tried. She simply needed to know the shape of the thing, the architecture of it, because she had spent enough of her life receiving things that turned out to have conditions that she needed to see the whole structure before she could agree to live inside it. Jake turned his coffee mug in his hands. "Because we take care of people who take care of ours," he said. "And because," he paused, the pause of a man who is choosing words that are honest rather than words that are easy. "People like you are the reason there's still something worth protecting in places like this." He looked at the room, the diner, Main Street visible through the window, the town beyond. The world needs people who will pay $18 to prove that a stranger matters. We try to be people who notice that. Near the door, Rick Navarro was leaning against the wall. Without the road grime and the exhaustion, he looked younger. He was watching Sarah with the careful, quiet attention she recognized from the night before. The attention of someone who is accustomed to watching rooms and has found, in this particular room, something that doesn't require wariness. Just witnessing. When Sarah saw him, the whole story closed into a circle. She said, "You should have told me." He shook his head slightly. Would it have changed anything? She thought about it. She thought about it for real. Not the reflexive, of course, not of someone who wants to say the right thing, but the actual internal reckoning of it. Whether knowing who he was, what the patch meant, what the potential consequences were, whether any of that would have changed what she did. Tommy in his dinosaur pajamas, deciding what he'd do first on a deserted island. You can't build food. No, she said. He smiled. It was small and arrived slowly, like a light in a window at the end of a long road. Like he'd known the answer before he asked the question, and had wanted to hear her say it anyway. Detective Ray Sykes appeared at Sarah's other side. He had been sitting in his corner with his coffee and his complicated thoughts, running quiet assessments that kept arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion, which was that whatever this was, it was not something that required his professional intervention. "Ms. Mitchell," he said. He had the look of a man making a calibration. "Detective," she said. "I want you to know," he stopped. Started again. "I've been in law enforcement for 19 years. He looked at Jake, at Rick, at the room. "And he stopped again. "This is a good outcome," he finally said, with the clipped precision of a man who usually doesn't say things like that and has decided to say it today. "Congratulations on your new position." He offered his hand. She shook it. He nodded once at Jake. Jake nodded back. Sykes put his hat on and walked out into the October morning. Sarah sat at her counter, and felt the room around her, the warmth of it, the coffee smell, and the sound of conversation, and the chrome and leather presence of 47 people who had ridden 47 miles to keep an $18 debt. She thought she might cry. She thought she was almost certainly going to cry, which was fine, because Linda was already providing excellent precedent. "Okay," she said, to Jake, to the room, to the morning. She said it the way you say the first word of something important, carefully, fully, meaning all of it. Okay. 1 year later, the sign had been repainted in September. It still said Millhaven Family Diner in the dark green lettering that Gerald's father had commissioned in 1971 and that the town had oriented itself around for 53 years. But below it, in simpler black letters on a white strip, someone had added a line that hadn't been there before: "Everyone welcome." It had been Rick's idea. He'd mentioned it in June when he stopped in. Sitting at the same stool at the counter where Jake had made Sarah an offer she hadn't been able to find a reason to refuse. He'd looked at the sign and said, offhandedly, that it might be a good thing to say out loud, and Sarah had told him that it didn't need to be said because she'd always believed it and always acted on it, and he'd said, "That's exactly why it needs to be said, because someone coming through the door doesn't know that yet." She had stood at the counter and considered this for a moment. Then she had called the sign painter. The diner was doing the best it had done in 20 years. This was not, she knew, entirely about management, though she had turned out to be very good at managing, which had surprised almost no one except Sarah herself. It was partly about the story, which had traveled through the town and then somewhat beyond it, in the way that certain stories do in small places, gathering the specific weight that comes from being both true and good. People came in who'd heard about it. Some came from the next county. One retired couple had come from as far as Allentown, which was a 2-hour drive, because the woman had read something about it and decided the pie was worth investigating. The pie, in fact, was very good. Linda had refined her apple cinnamon over 22 years into something that required no defenders. Linda still worked there. She had Sundays off now, which she spent in a way she declined to fully explain, but which involved a bird-watching group in Westenberg and someone named Frank who was apparently excellent company. She had not elaborated beyond this, and Sarah had learned not to push. Darius worked the breakfast shift. He was 24, recently released, and had shown up one morning with a resume that Sarah had read carefully, twice, before hiring him. He had a way with the regulars and an unexpected gift for baking that he'd been developing in the kitchen on slow mornings, and his cinnamon rolls had become a weekday ritual. A connection through the Iron Souls had helped with his parole supervisor's initial hesitation, which was a conversation that had required several phone calls and 0 specific disclosures, and resulted in a young man who showed up early every shift and had just started saving toward his own place. Tommy Mitchell was 9 now. He had, in fact, gotten to go on the field trip to the State Museum in Harrisburg, courtesy of Carol's $45 and the timing of a minor miracle. He came in after school on Tuesdays and Thursdays and did his homework in the corner booth by the window, the same booth that had been Earl Briggs's for 40 years, which Earl had graciously agreed to share with him in a formal arrangement that involved Earl's solemn promise to explain the newspaper to Tommy whenever requested. The bikers who came through, and they came through regularly, singly or in small groups, stopping for coffee and a meal on the way to wherever they were going, treated Tommy with an earnest, slightly over-formal respect that Sarah suspected was a studied thing, a deliberate gift. They called him young man. They asked his opinion on things. He had opinions, and he shared them, and they listened with the attentiveness of people who understood that being listened to is not a small thing. Jake visited twice a year. He came in October and in April, always on the same kind of morning, clear and cool, the town quiet, the parking lot filling one vehicle at a time. He drank his coffee and looked at the state of things with the steady, confirming attention of someone checking that a structure is holding. He asked Sarah how she was, and she told him the truth, because she had discovered that Jake Callahan was a person to whom you told the truth because it would not surprise him and because he would do something useful with it. In April of that first year, he had brought his mother. Ellen Callahan was 74 and stood 5'2" and had the face of a woman who has been beautiful and fierce and is now, at 74, simply fierce, which she appeared to prefer. She had looked at the diner and then at Sarah and had taken a long, assessing moment. "You're the one," she had said. Sarah hadn't been sure how to respond. "I think so," she'd said. Ellen had nodded once, as though a case had been resolved. She had ordered the blueberry pie and told Sarah it was excellent and left a very large tip, which Sarah had tried to redirect, and Ellen had redirected back with the calm authority of a woman who does not lose arguments. Rick came in on his birthday, every year. He sat at the same stool. He ordered a burger and fries and 3 cups of coffee. He and Sarah talked about Tommy, about the town, about whatever was happening in the world that was worth discussing and whatever was happening that was not. He told her, once, that his mother had liked birds, and that he'd started keeping a bird feeder outside his window at the compound, which some of his brothers found bewildering and had eventually begun quietly enjoying. He said this with the particular matter-of-fact quality of a person who has found a way to keep something of someone with him and does not feel the need to justify it. She had sent flowers when Esperanza passed, in February of that first year. She had found the address through Jake. She hadn't included a card because there was nothing she could write that was adequate, and she had learned, over 34 years of living, that the things that are too large for words are better served by presence than by the attempt to translate them. She had sent white lilies and yellow tulips because she had looked up what the hospital room had held and done her best to approximate comfort. Rick had called her 3 days later. The call had lasted 6 minutes. He had said, at the end of it, "I'm glad you were there that night." She had understood that he meant the diner and the rain and all of it. She had said, "Me too." On her last evening in October, a year after Gerald Holt had stood in his own diner and taken her apron in front of an audience, Sarah Mitchell stood at the window of the Millhaven family diner and looked at Main Street in the last of the evening light. The trees were doing their luminous October thing. A car went by slowly. The traffic light at Grover changed for no one, and then changed back. She thought about the field trip Tommy had just gone on, to Independence Hall this time, a bigger one, organized by his school with an actual charter bus. She had written the check for $60 and handed it in a week early. She had thought, when she did it, about nothing except that she was glad. She thought about the man who had ridden in from the rain, hungry and tired, carrying something too large for language. She thought about how small it had been, what she'd done, $18.40. One decision, small and obvious, in a moment when the obvious thing was also the costly thing. She thought about how the world had a way, sometimes, of noticing. Outside, the sign caught the last of the light. The new edition, "Everyone Welcome," was already weathering into the wood, becoming part of the sign, becoming part of the building, becoming part of the town. Sarah turned off the last of the kitchen lights. She put on her jacket. She walked home.